Welcome. Can people hear me? Great. Thank you. So my name is Roger Berkowitz, and I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. And welcome to the virtual reading group. Today we are continuing just the second session to read the first section of Hannah Arendt's last unfinished book, The Life of the Mind. And I just want to, before I jump in, introduce Samantha Hill, Assistant Director of the Center, who's on this call, and she'll be leading some of the sessions. And since we have a number of new people, I thought I'd introduce her. Samantha, can you say hello?
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the virtual reading group. Looking forward to talking about thinking.
Great. So thanks, Samantha, and we'll try and both be on as many of these as we can. It's the summer and we're both traveling a lot, so we'll do our best. So I want to. This is a difficult book, and it's also not your typical Arendt book in that it's about the life of the mind. And so much of her work is about the real world, the commonsensical world, the world of action, the world of appearance, and that all comes into this book. We can see her thinking. But I just want to back up a little bit and remind ourselves some of the things we talked about last class very briefly, last session. The first thing that I want us to remember is that Hannah Arendt's not a philosopher. And we talked a little bit about this last time. It's really an important point. She's interested in the world, not necessarily a tradition of ideas, the history of being in the Heideggerian sense. She says she comes to this book through for two reasons. One, in her encounter with Adolf Eichmann, and she saw him as thoughtless, and she asks the question, could the activity of thinking condition against evil? And in many ways, this first section of The Life of the Mind on thinking is about that exactly. What is thinking? What is the activity of thinking? And that's what we have to keep reminding ourselves, that she's asking, what is this activity of thinking that may or not be able to condition ourselves against doing of evil? The second reason she turns to this question is that in the human condition, her first, big book. I mean, not her first big. Her first big book was The Origins of Totalitarianism. Her first foray into a general book on what it is to be human as a condition, not an essence. She focuses on action, and she, in a way, brackets off contemplation and thinking. And then at the end of the book, she quotes Cato via Cicero, who says, never is a man more active than when he does nothing. And she sort of leaves it at that. And she is now returning to that question. She refers to this book in her Denktagebuch, in her notes, as volume 2 of the human condition. And so it's important to understand that, this is sort of the sequel, unfinished as it is. She thinks all of us have the ability to think, have the inclination and ability to think beyond our knowledge. And this is a key distinction, the distinction between thinking and knowing, or thinking and cognition, that we're going to continue to encounter in this book. And she develops this as a distinction between, in Immanuel Kant's work, between Verstand and Vernunft. Verstand is cognition, or the intellect. Intellect aims at truth, and it seeks to know things. Whereas Vernunft, a translation of the Greek nous, is not about knowing things and finding their truth. It's about thinking and discovering their meaning. And that's really the core of this book. She writes, the need of reason is not inspired by the quest for truth, but by the quest for meaning. when I read a book, or certainly a book by Hannah Arendt, but any great thinker, I want to find like the core sentence that I'm gonna keep coming back to as I read the book, and help me try and understand it. That's the sentence, right? The need of reason is not inspired by the quest for truth, but by the quest for meaning. And if after the 6 or 7 sessions that we will be together for reading this book, you can begin to explore and understand what that question means, I think you'll have learned a lot. I hope. The last thing I want to say by way of this introduction, again, somewhat of a summary, but I hope moving us forward, is that if we're interested in the quest for meaning, and the quest for meaning is found not in knowledge, not in understanding or cognition, but in thinking, one of the absolute core problems is that thinking is invisible. Seen from the perspective of appearances, the main character of mental activities, she says, is their invisibility. So what we have is this problem that we want to explore the quest for meaning, which happens through thinking, but thinking is invisible. How do we think about this invisible thing called thinking? What is it? How do we know it? And how can we nurture this invisible activity in other people in such a way that it may or may not condition them against evil? That is, I think, a question she's asking. Let me, in a way, that's somewhat review, but it's also, I think, more. So the first 2 chapters, which we talked about last week, again, I'm going to very briefly say the first one is the world's phenomenal nature. And the key, there's 2 keys here, or 3. The first is that the world is a plural world. It has spectators, and nothing appears in the singular. This is a very important idea of Arendt's. So the world is an appearing world, and to appear you need others. The second is that living beings have an urge to self-display, to appear to others. But the problem is that thinking withdraws from the world. It bends back upon the self, she says. And so the question she raises in this first chapter of the book on thinking is, how does thinking and other invisible activities appear in the world? Or do they? And I already gave an answer, somewhat of an answer to that through Susan, but that's what this is going to all be about. And then in the second chapter on true being and mere appearances, we get into a fundamental paradox that is going to run through this whole first section between being and appearance, and between Verstand and Vernunft, between intellect and reason, between truth and meaning. The point is that philosophy and science both, and she reads philosophy and science as part of the same anti-worldly drive, they seek truth behind appearances. And that's not wrong in the sense that the appearances are sometimes deceptive and there is a truth behind them. But they then, both science and philosophy, elevate truth above appearance. And that's what she calls the metaphysical fallacy, which is why science is metaphysical for her and for Heidegger. It sets the cause above the truth and the idea above the real world. And so that's the and yet it also, if it's smart science, recognizes that man is an apparent being. He lives in the real world of appearances, and that's a paradox. And that's what begins chapter 3, the reversal of the metaphysical hierarchy, the value of the surface, which was the first chapter we were reading for today. She begins with a discussion of science and progress, that science seeks progress. It seeks to disillusion us, die Entsäuberung der Welt, in Max Weber's terms. It seeks to take away the illusions, the mysticisms, and bring us to truth. But the first problem is that science never reaches a final truth. I mean, every stage of science is another hypothesis that we take as true, and then we realize some point down the road that there was a limitation to that, and we're going to get further truth. And in fact, she says, if we were ever to get to the truth, science would never be able to stop, because its entire premise is that there is no truth. Because you always have to seek below the truth. And yet science thinks you have to find the truth. And there's a paradox in that. There's also a paradox in that science seeks to elevate the hidden and the ideal, and yet the scientists themselves live in a real and apparent world. There's going to be a critique of the scientist then, insofar as the scientist attacks the meaningfulness of the apparent world, the world we live in, and seeks to create a fake world, a true world that will replace it. And that's a dangerous idea, because it's an attack on reality, and it can never be fully carried through in a world in which most people have a reality sense without a dangerous and potentially violent and terroristic attack on human individuality and variability. And so there is a deeply dangerous drive in the scientific desire to elevate a hidden and ideal truth over the real. Now, let me be very clear. This is not to say that science is totalitarian, but it is to say that all totalitarianism is pseudoscientific. One of the main points she makes in the origins of totalitarianism sections on totalitarianism is that totalitarianism is always ideological, and therefore it could not exist before the scientific age. Because what it says is that there is a logos, a truth of an idea that is so true that even when it doesn't fit with the apparent facts, it's still true, and what we have to do is deny the facts in order to protect the truth of our ideology. And what she says is an ideology, therefore, can't exist without science, but it is a pseudoscience, because science seeks to find the truth behind facts, and when it finds a discrepancy between the truth and facts, it has a problem. Whereas ideology, when it hits that discrepancy between truth and facts, seeks to actually erase the facts that are the problem and create the true world in the world of ideology. Science responds to this predicament and this difference between the ideal world and the real world, generally with functionalism. Now, again, this could be, one could easily say to Arendt, this is a reductive view of science. Not all science is functional, and I think she would clearly accept that. There are certainly scientists who move beyond reductionism and functionalism, and yet the basic idea here is that whenever you have appearances, a multitude of facts, what's meaningful is not the appearances, the facts. It's the laws, it's the rules, it's the laws that unite them and make them true, and give them a function and set them within a purposeful framework. And that's what science seeks to do. And she then, in this chapter, and this is a very important chapter for this reason, it's one of the most interesting chapters and texts that Arendt ever wrote, Chapter 3 here, on the reversal of the metaphysical hierarchy, the value of surface. She turns to a biologist named Adolf Portmann. He He wrote basically from the 30s to the 70s in the 20th century. And his main book, and he has a couple, but in The Beauty of Butterflies in 1936, he's intrigued by what he calls the phenomenon of variety. And he says that against functionalism, which asks, what purpose does beauty serve? So you all know butterflies. I mean, I don't know how many, but there's thousands, hundreds of thousands of different species of butterfly. And they have beautiful different wing structures and things. And he says, functionalism says, well, what purpose does the beauty serve? Does it help for reproduction? Does it help for keeping, the survival of the species? What does it do? How does beauty and variety serve in an evolutionary development? That's what he asks in The Beauty of Butterflies. Well, what he says is, against the functionalism, there's simply another way to look at the beauty of butterflies, which is that they respond to the desire to appear. And if you look at nature, he says, whether it's butterflies or Mediterranean sea turtles or tulips, all living things have a desire to appear. And in 1968, writing in her Denktagebuch, this is about the time when she starts to read Portman, so about 6 or 7 years before she's writing this book, Life of the Mind. She says in an entry in 1968, regarding Volume 2 of the Human Condition, all that lives strives to appear. See Portman. All functions show themselves, but not the silent dialogue of thinking, not the will, and also not judgment. They are without necessarily coming into appearance. And so, Volume 2 of the Human Condition that she's working on or thinking about already in 1968, all that lives strives to appear. See Portman. All functions show themselves, but not the silent dialogue of thinking. Thinking is this one thing that doesn't show itself. And we need to ask, therefore, what is this activity of thinking? On page 27 in The Life of the Mind, she says that individuals and species have functions, but these functions are only meaningful in the context of appearing and self-display. So it's not wrong to think that our organs and our bodies and everything we do serve some function, have some functionalism. And if we're interested in the question of truth, of intellect, of cognition, we can pursue those. But if we're interested in the question of meaning, that will only be encountered in the context of appearing and self-display. Now, I think you have to ask why. Why is it that meaning is not in truth, but only in appearance and self-display? And one answer is that meaning is not something that can be reduced to intellect, to knowledge. Meaning is less apparent than that, or less knowing than that. What is the quest for meaning, right? I mean, that's really what's going on here. One way to think about it is that she says that there's an innate impulse to self-display. Everything wants to appear. Everything alive wants to appear. And in self-display, I make my presence felt, seen, heard. I make my presence felt. To me, that's another key point in this book. And it goes back, or I connect it with a number of places in Arendt. where she says that, well, for example, in the Origins of Totalitarianism, where she says that the only truly human right is the right to be meaningful, the right to act and appear in public in ways that matter, is what she says. And here she says, make my presence felt, seen, and heard. It is to appear in a way that people say, oh, you exist, you matter, we have to take you seriously. That's not about, self-preservation, or that's not about me being a living being. It's not about me being part of an environmental movement or part of a biological or zoological or sociological world. It's about me, Roger Berkowitz. Why do I matter? I sit here and I talk to you. You guys listen to me, and I make my presence felt. And it can be me, and it can be a farmer who walks down the street and people take note of him or her. It can be anyone. The point is, it's when we appear and are seen in ways that self-display and make our presence seen, felt, and heard. That's when we matter. And she says on page 27, these functions are only meaningful in the context of appearing in self-display. You can't be meaningful as part of a sociological analysis that says that all men today or all people today are seeking are on Facebook and therefore lonely or whatever. Yeah, I mean, that tells us something about humanity, and it tells us something about the sociological way people are today, but it doesn't provide meaning to any of us. It may be true, but it's not meaningful. And this is what she takes. I mean, again, someone asked the question, I think Ken earlier, is she a good reader of these texts? Well, here's Portman, a biologist. She's certainly not a biologist. And she'll say over and over again in her analysis of Portman, well, he doesn't really see the implications of what he's saying. She's reading him in her way. And that's something she does brilliantly. But he was clearly pushing against the standard biological functionalism and saying there's another way to think these things. And she's pulling on it and saying this connects with thinking and meaning and appearance. So 4 is body and soul and mind. The key distinctions here, as I understand it, I'm going to try and be somewhat quick here, is between mind and soul on the one hand. And on the one hand, let's just look at mind for a second. These are going to be important distinctions for us to remember. Mind, metaphors allow mind to have a sensible appearance. So and part of the issue is here that when you think in words. You can't. I mean, this is a point she's going to make later again, but you can't think outside of words. I mean, it's a fascinating claim and one that I'd love to hear people's thoughts on. But can you think about something without putting it in, words? Can you think about a unicorn without thinking unicorn? Can you think about anything outside of the words and the world we live in? But she says, no, we always are in words already. We're already in a world and with metaphors. On the other hand, the soul is a weird thing because she connects the soul with passions and anger and emotions. And conceptual language is inadequate to the intensity which is expressed in a glance or sound or a gesture. And so she makes this distinction between the passions of the soul and the thoughts of the mind, if you want to put it in that way. I think I can put it in that way. Thinking, the thoughts of the mind can be without a body. There can be no sensations to them. Whereas the passions can't be active without a body. You can't be anger without anger showing in some way in your body. The passions, she says, are the same for all. Anger is anger. Ugliness or beauty is ugliness. The inner organs, have the same function for all of us. Lust is a sexual urge which is universal. Fear is needed to survive. We all have these things, and they're the same. There's fear is fear, lust is lust, for everyone. But love, as opposed to lust, is infinitely variable. And courage, as opposed to fear, is a decision not to show fear. And so there's this distinction she makes between the thoughts of the mind and the passions of the soul. And again, which one is she more interested in? Well, mostly in thinking here, so the thoughts of the mind. And this is going to be the transition to chapter 5, in which he says that courage is a choice. Love is a choice. Yeah, we all have lust and we all have fear, but when we turn from our passions to our thinking, we make choices, and it's a thoughtful decision. And in making such a choice, and in making such a thoughtful decision, we lie. We create a semblance. We present ourselves in a particular way, which is not the same as our inner passions. So when we say, I love you, however we say it and to whomever we say it, we are, in some sense, dissembling from lust in a way that's meaningful. But it's not. It's a semblance. It's a way of presenting ourselves. And so then the question is, do we continue to present ourselves as loving or courageous in a way that's consistent and lasts through time, at which point our semblance takes on the form of a character and becomes what she'll call an authentic semblance, what she'll also call an unavoidable illusion. So if you act courageously continually, or you act as a lover continually and not as a lustful person or not as fearful, eventually that semblance will become an authentic illusion or authentic semblance, which will also be an unavoidable illusion, and it will become part of your character and who you are. And this brings us to the chapter 5, which is on appearance and semblance, in which he says that what appears may be mere semblance on page 37, but that mere semblance doesn't have to be mere. It can also be an authentic semblance. And it is an authentic semblance to the extent that it becomes in some meaningful way unavoidable and inherent.